Episode 4. This episode is part of the Faith and Nexus Exploring Children's Spirituality series, and it explores spirituality and storytelling. It takes a different approach to the other podcasts. We explain why we use storytelling animation to illustrate the Nexus research findings.
Welcome again to our fourth podcast now in a series of podcasts from Faith in the Nexus. Just to recap a little bit, the previous three podcasts looked at children's spirituality. We explored a little bit by what we meant by spirituality and how we understood children's spiritual development. Now, this one, we want to focus in particular just on one aspect, on storytelling, children's spirituality and storytelling. So I'd like to welcome my two guests today, Nick and Kieran. Nick?
Yes, hello. I'm Nick Taunt. I was for 18 years head teacher of a Church of England comprehensive in Chichester, and now working as a consultant with Canterbury Christ Church University.
And Kieran.
Hello, my name is Kieran O'Brien. I'm the director of Ministory, and we're a storytelling agency. It specialises in creating animations, video content, but also I have a strong interest and passion for spirituality.
I'm Ann Casson, the senior researcher on Faith in the Nexus project, which we looked at children's experience of faith and spiritual life in church primary schools and how that related to connections to church and what happened in the home. As we produced the report, as we came near to the end of producing the research report, we decided we wanted to get the story out there in a different way. We wanted to get the children's voices, the children's stories, of which we had so many in the research, out to a wider audience. And we were looking initially at doing talking heads videos, that one way would have been to hear the children themselves tell their stories. But as we began this in March 2020, we entered lockdown, and it was obviously impossible to get into schools or to produce a video in any way where we could use children as the telling their own stories. So we started looking around for different ways. How could we still get the story out there without doing talking heads videos? And it was that point we looked at storytelling animation, and we approached Kieran O'Brien at Ministory to say, well, we've got all these stories. How can we tell them? In what ways can we tell them? And that's where, I went to Kieran with, this is what we've got. What is this any use? How could you tell these stories? Kieran, do you want to pick it up from there and sort of say, when we first raised that question, what were your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's a very useful question because most people come to me as clients and they want things explained. We have this bit of information, we want you to know it, and they see it in animation. That's a great way of putting it online and explaining what we want, whether it's a campaign, whether it's marketing or whatever it is. And I always have to have a little bit of a pushback, saying actually we're storytelling and there's a difference. We're not here to make what I call an animated PowerPoint, where you have your bullet points, but you use music and movements to make it a little bit more interesting. Storytelling is a different kind of a technique and strategy, which is around trying to get to the heart of what you're trying to do and trying to connect audiences with the ultimate goal, what you want to move them onto. And how do we help engage audience at a deeper level? How do we unpack some of the themes and the content, the rich content that came out of the research? So the conversation we then moved on to is, what is the story here?
Yes.
It's one of those annoying questions because there's, we've got some research, we want people to know it. Yeah, but what's a real story? And we keep digging and digging deeper to find out what the real story is. And that's where this whole project has come around. The animation is a way to unpack some of the fantastic findings in the research, but not to explain it, to give it to audiences so they hear it, because they can read the reports. They're more than welcome to read the report, but how do they engage in it an emotional level, and how do they explore some of those real rich themes that the research found?
It doesn't surprise me at all that Anne, you approached Kieran from many stories. The stories are so central to education, to what's going on in school, that we almost forget they're there. I mean, you only need to see children in the playground on their stepping stones, pretending that they are crocodiles if they miss the next stone. Yeah. To see a story at work, and some of the excitement of the fear of being eaten up by a crocodile in mid-morning break, is what motivates children, but also in the classroom. All the time, we're actually making stories, even if it's turning a problem into a story. You have a cake, and John eats half of it, and Jill eats 2/6 of it. You know, how much is left over? And it's the context in which makes sense of a problem. You know, what's if you add, you know, half plus a sixth equals how much, is less interesting and less motivating. And as Kieran, as you're saying, it's something that powers the imagination, isn't it? But also engages, like two cogs coming together. It engages you because you're actually involved in it. You're imagining it, and you're involved in the sense that you can put yourself into the story, and you can see yourself. Well, what would I do in that situation? You're asking yourself. It's an incredibly powerful tool that we have in our brains to take stories, to make sense of ourselves and the world around us, and also to involve ourselves in stories which we probably wouldn't want to be involved in real life. Too frightening, but absolutely fascinated in identifying with and exploring. And that very exploring is building up and developing our learning and our wider understanding.
Yeah. And picking up on that, Nick, in school, as an art former RE teacher, in RE, we use stories all the time. You Christian stories, when you're teaching about Christianity, it's through stories. It's all, as this we've talked about before, you know, you've got your facts, but actually what's engaging, what is looking at the Christian stories, you know, where am I in this story? You know, what actually happened in this story? And it's exploring through Christian stories and Christian, you know, Jesus's parables, that actually you begin to start making sense of the world. And I think that's a key element of stories. It's that enabling you to make sense of something which is probably, you know, beyond, you know, easily making sense of ideas.
Yes, so much of the world is actually abstract. So much of what's important to us as people is abstract. I mean, what is love? Mm-hmm. What does it look like? You might have the type of love which is best explained through the story of the prodigal son, that unconditional love that the father shows.
And I think that's really important. And I think coming back to, you know, the Faith in the Nexus research as we're coming to Kieran, you know, why did you think storytelling would work so well with, you know, what we'd told you about the Nexus findings at that stage? What was there that resonated with you and you thought, well, actually, this will, you know, work, this will flow?
Well, to answer that question, I probably need to tell a story.
Best way, Kieran.
You know, lead by example. And it's how did I find myself running a storytelling business when it's my background is not storytelling at all. It really is the opposite. I used to be a risk analyst many years ago, very analytical, numbers, charts, and all that. Then worked from the charity sector for a number of years. Where I really discovered that storytelling has an immense power. When I gave presentations, which were very well done, you know, had really, really good points, and I worked on the fonts and everything. You know, they looked lovely. They really did. I saw the audience go, oh, you know, that was good. But when I told a story, you could see people I don't know, just change. There's a dynamism when you tell a story, and when you tell a good story. And I'm talking about other people's stories, your own story. Your own story has great power. And I can remember giving a presentation once, and I hadn't really done the homework. And I kind of hadn't really got that presentation or the research together. So I decided I'll just tell a little story about a trip I went to overseas. And the whole room was absolutely silence. And I realized all the way through that, every single pair of eyes were focused on what I was saying. And I realized we need to do more of this. Why aren't we better at storytelling? Why have we relegated it for this kind of, we need to get information out there, we need people to understand, and all the bullet points, which is all important because people do need to understand, they do need information. But storytelling is doing something really different. It's engaging people emotionally. People can put themselves into that situation. So when in my story I talked about being in a room with a group of women who were all HIV positive, and each one was telling their story of how they've been abandoned by their husband. They've got some children. 3 of them were also HIV positive. 2 of them weren't. And all the way through, they're all telling their stories. And these stories were all devastating because while they're telling stories, you're trying to work out, what do you do with 3 children who are HIV positive and 2 are negative? Do you put the 2 who are negative into school and the other 3, do they stay at home? All these questions, like, how do you deal with this awful situation? So when you take people into that room with you, when you tell that story, the stories those women told me now becomes my story. And that story I tell to people becomes their story, and they tell to others. So storytelling has this power to replicate. It's viral in nature. It can move out. So this kind of revelation to me kind of brought me on to storytelling, because at the time I was kind of making lots of kind of animations, and I realized it's not about fancy animations. It's the story beneath that's important. That if you get the story right, it resonates. It kind of brings people into the moments, and it changes them. You're transformed through storytelling. So when we talk about storytelling and spirituality, they absolutely go hand in hand. And it's no wonder that's in if you look in marketing, in the whole private sector now, the word storytelling is on trend. Everyone is talking about storytelling. How do we tell our story? Because all of a sudden we're just woken up. Actually, storytelling is really important. We know it leads to long-term kind of memory retention. If you tell a story, much more likely to remember information. It engages people emotionally. It can also transform behavior. If you hear a story, it can change how you see the world. And that's another great power of storytelling. It helps to frame how you see the world.
Yes, but what happened next? What happened to the mother? What did she do? How did she cope? You can't stop the story there, Kieran.
Exactly. And that's, again, the power of storytelling. We need to get to the end. And that's why they use it in marketing. If you use a hook to open up a story, people, that's impulse. You cannot leave a story hanging. You cannot leave it in midair. So you're drawn into that kind of story, that conversation that you want to find out more. And that's why we'll see in storytelling really grow exponentially sits in the private sector, which leads on to another question, I think, which is quite important for us working in spirituality and Christianity, is that if the whole private sector and everyone is talking about storytelling, why aren't we talking about it that much?
Yes. Yeah.
Why aren't we really going back and exploring this idea back to the point we just made? Jesus told stories, and through those stories, he's transformed the world, culture, philosophy, theology, its architecture. All these have been transformed back to some really basic, simple stories about lost coins, lost sheep, some guy returning home after going off and spending all his fortune. If you break them down into individual components, they're not great stories. You're not going to tune into Netflix to watch a story about the lost sheep. But these stories hold immense power. And what's really interesting from a spirituality point of view is we tell those stories and we keep listening to them again and again and again. And somehow, if you think about it, when we hear a story, when we watch a film, it's great, you enjoyed it, but you want to move on to the next one. You know, you're very reluctant to watch films again unless they're really, really good. You're much more likely to watch the new one that comes out, the new blockbuster. So it's strange in spirituality, we keep coming back to the same stories again and again. It's that there's something going on here. And it's not just about information. There's something deeper happening. That when we're in dialogue with these stories, something is transforming within us.
I think that's really important. And I think the key question that I want to raise with both of you now is, I'm working with children, and I wanted to get these children's voices out, these children's stories, but often stories are thought of children's things. It's just a childish thing, having a story. You know, the Christian stories are just for children. It's just, and I think that's the big thing. You know, we've got two things here: that wanting to hear the stories and listening to the stories of the children, and also getting over that big barrier that stories are for children. The Christian stories are for children. And I think that was one of the hurdles through my research, that, you know, qualitative research, listening research, it's doing a lot of interviews with very few questions, but just listening to people's stories, that you'll hear some really profound and deep stories, which we are sharing through all the other ways that we're sharing the research. But to get those stories out there and to get that resonance, which we picked up with Minna's stories, that stories are not just childish things which we put away as we get older. And I think that's really important. Nick, did you want to? Yeah.
Yes, and stories are no less important for older children as for younger children, and indeed, as Kieran's pointing out, for us. I think I can think of a couple of ways. I think one of the issues with older children feeling that stories are in some way childish is that they do associate them with rather childish pictures perhaps in children's Bibles of Jesus in long flowing clothes, sitting by a boat on a lake. And there appears to be, from the pictures, no relevance to those adolescents' experience of now. But of course, Jesus' stories are timeless, and they don't need to be linked to stories of a kind of make-believe Palestine. And they work in any context. So I think one thing we need to do is to make the context relevant for now. The prodigal son is no less relevant now than it was 2,000 years ago. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think we need to listen harder. And very often it's through listening that, and in discussing with a child how they're feeling, that we might actually say, well, you know that story about, and then we explore, you know that story about the lost sheep. Jesus seems to be talking about himself, doesn't he? What does that suggest? And you can then move on from that point. So you actually need to find the story that matches the child at that particular point. If I'm feeling happy about all sorts of things, I don't want to hear a story about something sad. If I'm feeling sad, I don't want to hear a story about something which is happy necessarily. We have to find a story that's relevant at that point.
I think picking up on that, Nick, it's the idea that it resonates. And I think what we were trying to do is we were telling the story of the research, and what we found telling the story of research is that, you know, it resonates with so many people that actually it's not a unique, wow, I've never come across that, it's never happened to me sort of story, but it is just a story that resonates. And as people hear this story, their story is affirmed, that they think, well, actually, you know, that's me, that's happened to me, and, you know, I can understand that. And it's getting that balance, isn't it, that yes, we've got, you know, fantastic findings in this research and whatever, but actually it's resonating. It's actually a lot of it you think, well, that's a common sense story, but we need to hear those stories for people to be able to say. Kieran, you're looking.
Well, it's because when I read the research, first of all, you know, there's some, you know, really helpful and interesting insights, you know, in terms of numbers of children who think these things. but the real power I felt, I think most people feel, is the stories from the children themselves.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a question back to you, Anne, really, sits because isn't there a power in the research that you're sitting down and actually, in one sense, you're a storyteller. You might not feel like it. By listening to the children and listening to their stories, you're telling it through a different medium.
And I think that's really important. All the research that I've done within NICER is by bringing those voices to the fore, the voices that are unheard, children's voices, and to some extent they're filtered through me. Obviously, that we've got as much as we can of quotes, but it's my interpretation. But so many times I've sat down with children and with adults, and you spend half an hour with them just listening. You're not there to say, "Oh, that's stupid," or I've done something like that. You just listen to their story. And once you've got that rapport, a couple of minutes to, establish that you're not going to criticize, you're not going to judge, and you can just listen. And people would share with you, adults often share with you things, well, I've never told anybody this, and feel at the end, often the children enjoy it. They enjoy sitting down and talking. Adults do as well, and say, well, that was really good. I feel good. And it's something about having somebody listen to your story, and then knowing that that person's really interested in your story and wants to tell other people your story, is that affirming power of research, which I think is really important, in getting those stories out there to other people, so other people can think, well, actually, I'm not alone in this. Other people think like this. And I think that that's another key thing with these stories, that it's resonating with lots of people. It's like affirming not only the person that I've sat and listened to, but other people who think, well, actually, yeah, that's just like me. And it's putting back to what we were talking about before, it's putting ourselves in the story. Part of stories is, where are we? As we read a novel, you think, well, which character would I be? Oh, I wouldn't, the Pride and Prejudice, I have to, you read through, you think, well, which daughter would I be? Yeah. And things like that. You put yourselves, sorry, Nick, you probably don't think which daughter would I be. But, yeah.
I don't think I should suggest.
But I think it's putting ourselves in the stories. Nick, you were going to say.
Well, the story goes about when in the early days of the Samaritans, Chad Farah, the clergyman who set it up, used to sit in his office in his church, and people would sit in a little room outside waiting to see him. And as the queues got longer, he would, at the end of one discussion with someone in his room, he would open the door and the person would go out, and he would say, in effect, next. One day he said that, and the next person in the queue of however many, a lot of people sitting in this around these walls of this room, the next person said, "Oh, Vicar, I've spent so long waiting to see you that I got talking with my mate next door, and I told him everything, and I'm fine now, I don't need to see you." So off he walked. Yeah. And the mere sense of articulating what's on your mind gives you the opportunity to frame it, as we were saying earlier. Mm-hmm. And almost unwittingly, subconsciously, your story takes on a shape, because stories do. They have a beginning and a middle and an end. And even if the end ends in questions, the first two bits of that story have helped you to make sense of why you're feeling as you are. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of Samaritans, which is, after all, a listening service, helping people to talk to a stranger who is there to listen.
And I think, sorry, Kieran, go.
Sorry, I just to reaffirm that the power of listening, it can help to unlock your own story. In cognitive behavioral therapy, they talk about if you want to transform people's behaviors, they realize that there's no point telling people what they ought to do and how they should do it, and they just have better willpower to do it. They need to find out what their story is, their inner narrative. And until you find out what your inner story is, you cannot break those cycles of behavior. So by listening to someone, by helping people to articulate what their story is, you do something really, really powerful. And in spirituality, it's such an important point. I don't think you can do spirituality by yourself. So where you do close yourself off, there's a dialogue there. You're sits with someone, whether you're in conversation with God or in conversation with others, to help you to go deeper, to discover what is your story, who am I, where do I belong. So that's where the overlap between storytelling and spirituality is really strong, because it helps you break into that inner narrative of who you are, where you belong. And we all hold a story. And so it was really interesting to hear that, it's when we listen to someone tell their story, you can notice the person change because they feel affirmed, they feel validated. And we talk about, Faith in the Nexus, talk about this word we use all the time, resilience. How do you create a resilient spirituality? And it might sound very difficult and complicated, but actually it's quite simple in some ways. And some of the simple techniques are, first of all, listen. Really listen to someone's story, and pay attention to what they pay attention to, because storytelling shows you, it reveals your values. What you pay attention to, it shows how you see the world. And then when you listen to someone's story, you can see through their eyes. You can understand how they're seeing a problem. So when it comes to, I'm sure Nick will attest to this in education, if someone's having real problems, there's no point trying to put a wall chart up and say, look, let's get some goals. You can really push yourself and really motivate yourself to complete this task. There's an important role around listening. Why do you find it difficult? What's the barriers? What's the thinking patterns that's stopping you from doing what you want to do? So storytelling, when it comes to our own stories, holds so much power in helping us to transform our behavior and how we see and interact and relate to others.
And you mentioned resilience there, which means bouncing back. One of the features of the ways of developing resilience is precisely by reflecting and talking through the issues that you're finding difficult at the moment. And the mere act of the talking gives you a sense of perspective that then allows you to move on to the next step and to bounce back.
And I think it's the telling of the stories, going back to the spirituality, the children's spirituality, as you tell the story, it's finding your meaning and purpose. And sometimes, you can only do that by telling it and rethinking it. I love the words that one of the children I interviewed told. So I need to go home and rethink that. And I think it's retelling these stories again and again. We've got a story, but that's not the end. It's not, you don't tell it once. You go back to it. And the other way with engaging with stories, that watching, for example, the animation story that we made up, you can watch it once and see something, and you watch it the next time and it resonates in a different way. And it's the same with all stories, that it's that connection, isn't it, between you as an individual at that moment in time and that place in your life and the story, and how that story fits into your story. We're back to your jigsaw puzzle, Nick, with all the pieces coming together.
Yes, and we've used the word resonance a lot, and the idea of a bell resonating, or of I don't know if you sing in the bathroom, but when you do, you can probably hear there's one particular note that just takes over in the bathroom. It just echoes. That sense of resonance being finding the absolute spot which is absolutely real. A string on a violin which resonates, and the whole body of the violin vibrates with that particular pitch on the string. It is itself in a way that other notes aren't quite that violin itself. The sense of being completely true is perhaps one of the goals of our spiritual lives, to be and our whole lives, of course, to be true to ourselves. when we feel we are ourselves without any gloss or a deception or makeup. We are just ourselves, and resonance can come through the honesty of telling stories about ourselves.
I think that's really, that really hits home, doesn't it? And I think that as we were telling the stories, and certainly as we've told the story of Faith in the Nexus again and again, the structure sort of emerges. And I know we had long conversations, Kieran and Nick, didn't we, as to how we structure this story, our story of the research, so that it really resonates with people. Kieran, do you want to, talk a little, yeah, about how, we try to think, how do we structure this?
Yeah, so behind the whole resource, there's obviously a storytelling theory that's been applied, and it's so subtle that most people won't notice
Nobody
it.
knows it.
You'll notice it if it doesn't work. It's like when you watch a bad film or a good film but has a bad ending, and you end up, well, if you don't follow a certain kind of storytelling methodology, things just don't resonate. There's a dissonance there. Things just don't connect somehow. And trying to create resonance and avoid dissonance is it's quite easy once you know what the techniques are. But what's really powerful about that word resonance, I just want to pick up on it because it's an important one for not only in helping children with their spirituality, but with all of us, is that somehow there's something in Jesus' stories that deeply resonates. You can't deny that. There's something in there. And if you had to analyze it and pick it out, you couldn't find it. Or if you break down the word, sentence, or structures, or try to repeat it, it's not there. There's something else really deeply behind it. And it's when when I was starting my storytelling kind of business, I was working with clients, companies who are trying to get their story out, and it's they've built a web page and they put some my story on there, which is all very nice, which is their backstory. But what I was arguing to them is they're not really doing storytelling. They're still stuck in an old mindset, and it's all to do with how you relate to people. And there's something in scripture that really resonates, and it has to do with it's the way Jesus tells a story. It's to do with around power. And there's something around he always empties himself when he's in conflict with someone. He doesn't seek the higher ground. Oh, I'm the Son of God. I can outwit you in whatever argument you bring to me. And whenever someone asks him a question, he doesn't come back with an answer. He tells a story. And something really interesting is going on there because he's trying to help you to see deeper. Rather than giving you an answer, so all the stories say, well, let's think about this a little bit deeper. Let's go deeper. Let me tell you a story. And in that story, we can start playing around with some of these kind of deeper concepts, these different ideas of who God is, what is the nature of God, and how do we relate to a divine love, which is merciful. You can't really put that in bullet points. So when we're doing storytelling, there's an opportunity to use that kind of mentality that we're not here to win the argument. And that's my real bugbear with society today in social media. Everyone's out to win the argument. Politics is painful to watch because everyone's trying to outwit the other side. And it leads nowhere. It just leads to this kind of circle of conflict, which doesn't really take us to any deep or meaningful place. So in storytelling, you don't try to win. You try to help others see deeper. And that's what's really important, I guess, as a parent with my children, is how can I help them to see deeper? Do I give them a book? Do I get someone else to do it for them? Actually, I have a role in this, and I could do that through storytelling. That doesn't mean picking up a book, going through Noah's Ark kind of storytelling narratives. It's to find out what their story is and how can I help them to see deeper through telling my story. Sharing how do I see the answer to their question. And in the research and in the animation, we talk a lot about when confronted with these questions by children, how do we deal with them? And the kind of simple approach is try to answer as quickly as possible. Try to get out of that situation as quickly as you can. But the harder and more tougher approach is to really listen. So what's the question behind here? And then to start telling a story about how do I see, what's my story in response to that question. And that's what we call a shoulder-to-shoulder approach, how you sit alongside someone, listen to them, and then try to walk together. You're not there to win or come out with an answer to trump their question. You're there to, how can we get to that deeper, to what's underneath. And it's not easy, I know that, but it's enjoyable. It's so much fun. It's so enriching to sit with your children, or as a teacher with their students, and to really see the insights. And that's what was really interesting from the research. There's so much wisdom that comes from children. You kind of overlook it. So, well, they're there to learn. Actually, we're there to learn from them in so many ways. They hold so many simple ways to look at the world, but really, really profound.
And a theme of the research, which runs all the way through it, is that very often it's the children who are the instigators of conversation. And as adults, we simply need to be ready for it, and to help them by encouraging them in exploring together, and using the stories that are at our that are our resources, that are at our disposal, to help to explore further, and as Kieran says, deeper and deeper.
I think that's a key point that came out of the research. The role of children. Now, I talked about, well, we wanted the animation to bring the children's voices to the fore, but actually, what is underlying what came through the research is that the children's voices are there, and they are instigating these conversations. They are instigating the questions. They're instigating the practices, and we need to listen to them and to be aware and acknowledge and affirm them by listening, but also, going back to Kieran, to engage with them, to have that shoulder-to-shoulder approach, not to shut it down and say, oh, it's just childish, which often, childish stories, or to just ignore, be indifferent, but actually, what's happening here? And I think it's that attitude, that deeper, how are children finding meaning and purpose? That curiosity, how is my child finding meaning and purpose? What story are they telling themselves that we need to get through to? Kieran, you look like you were.
Yeah, and when you're saying that, it's back to my earlier story about doing my presentations, realizing my well-formulated PowerPoint presentations, how very beautifully designed, were having no impacts, well, lesser impacts on the audience than my storytelling. What that helped me to reflect on is, why don't we tell stories?
Mm-hmm.
And when I asked this question to a group of clients, the answer is quite interesting. It's like, well, storytelling is for other people, it's for people who are experts, who are better at this. I don't have a story, and that belief, we don't have a story. It's when you listen to other people, they're really interested. That they're obviously good at storytelling, but not me.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's the other way around. When we listen to other people, we hear the power of storytelling. You have that, story within you, but it's like a lack of confidence that it's maybe I'm not good enough to have to tell my story. And what I loved about the research is, it was a beautiful way of just sitting down with the children and getting them to tell their story. And when I work with clients, the opening question is, where did this story begin? And that leads into a wonderful conversation. So when someone has a problem, say, okay, that sounds, it's quite serious. But where does the story begin? How do we get to where we were? And then you start unpacking everything. And through that kind of storytelling narrative, you discover so much about other people. Like another workshop I ran, since I got volunteers for the charity to sit down and tell their story. Why were they there today? Just for 10 minutes, for one to the other. And by the end of it, there was some people in tears. I never knew that. The emotion that came from that other person's story. And that was me standing at the front with the microphone and saying, you should have the microphone. You're the ones who have these wonderful stories. And then the next question, why don't you tell them? Which whole point of the workshop is we're afraid to tell our stories. But when we do tell our stories, we, in many ways, we reveal our hearts. And there's a vulnerability in that. And whether we're willing to be vulnerable is another thing. But allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, that's why Jesus' stories are so powerful. They're all about vulnerability. They're not about being right or being above or correct. It's all about to open up the heart to something deeper. And that's where when we're sitting down with our children, there's almost a request there. Allow yourself to become vulnerable with the children, to open your heart and say, actually, this is how I see the world. With the fear that they might laugh at it or say, well, that's a bit strange. There's always a vulnerability in sharing stories. So, it's back to the power of storytelling when you speak from the heart. It's really, really important.
And that picks up on something that we've talked about earlier about trust. That
Yes.
there is a unique feature of a parent-child relationship, which is unbreakable and is trusting and loving. And it's within that relationship that both you, the adult, and you, the child, can open yourselves up and be vulnerable. And it's very unusual for an adult to be vulnerable to a child, because it's easy to feel, well, I'm the strong one, I mustn't allow this, and this will affect them. And of course, sometimes that is absolutely the case, but particularly with slightly older children, perhaps into secondary school, there may be opportunities where that sort of vulnerability is a shared one, because we will all have stories from our own adolescence which are probably quite similar, or at least shared similar feelings as those that our adolescent children are going through. But that seems to be a crucial part of storytelling, that there is an audience that is open and attentive, and potentially vulnerable itself.
Mm-hmm. I think we've got quite deep there, looking at the vulnerability of telling your stories. We have started the importance of telling stories, but actually, when you're telling your story, it does make you vulnerable. You do need that trust and that non-judgmental. And I think it's just back to how we respond to children, making themselves vulnerable by telling their stories and asking these questions, I think is really important. And I think the listening, that's the other thing that struck me from this conversation, is the importance of listening to other people's stories as much as you tell your own story, and sharing your own story is perhaps key.
Yeah, and I think one of the important findings in the research is when we looked at why parents weren't sitting down with their children. There was that fear that there's always someone better at doing this stuff than me. There's a trained youth worker or a religious leader or teacher. They're much better at dealing with children's questions and deep questions around spirituality. Why do people die, suffering, and all those big challenging questions. And in the animation, we kind of played around of how do we deal with this anxiety of the parents. And there is a real anxiety that we feel embarrassed. And that was a kind of key word that came out. Parents feel embarrassed talking about spirituality, because they might not have spoken about spirituality since they were younger, or faith. So trying to relearn this language which they've kind of lost. It's not that simple. It's a challenge in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, we have to kind of allow ourselves, some forgiveness for not just being able to jump into a spiritual conversation with children. It is challenging, but by the same token, it's nothing to be afraid of. It is we do know these children. And actually, what was so enriching, as I already said, it was just listening to the insights from what the children are saying around the big questions which we all struggle with. they had said these wonderful ways of how they have created an inner narrative to help the world become a safe world. And that's the other important thing of storytelling and children's development, is that when children are really young, we sit down and we tell stories, more and more stories, and their appetite for stories is incredible. They'll just absorb as many stories as you can give them. But all those stories have a deep kind of psychological function, which is to help them see that this world is a safe world, that so good always triumphs evil, whatever the story is. So it's however kind and mild it might be, and that it ends with a happy ending. That the world we live in is a safe world. And if we don't have that foundation, that this world is not a safe world, it's a world in which we should be fearful, it's a dangerous world, and that can lead to so much kind of trauma, and it can really impact on you as growing up. So having storytelling as a foundation, knowing that this world is a safe world, that's a beautiful world, and that in this world, God has created this world, and God is with you at every step. This sets the foundation for which we talk about a resilient spirituality to grow. Without that foundation, we're left to fend for ourselves, which has a whole range of its consequences.
Just to pick you up on one point, Kieran, there, you talked about parents not being confident. I think what the research showed that it's teachers and clergy as well not being confident to have those spiritual conversations with children. They might take different approaches to parents in not having those conversations, but I think that lack of confidence goes across all adults. That many adults would find it difficult to sit down with a child to engage shoulder to shoulder in a spiritual conversation. Nick, sorry, I jumped in before you.
It's I don't want to make it sound as if it's very complicated. In fact, if your prime behavior as the adult is to listen, then all the cues for what you might say come from what the child is saying, and what your child is saying will bring up stories of your own which you can share. And I wonder whether one reason why we're not good as adults talking about spiritual matters is precisely because we don't actually spend long enough listening.
Yes.
And we're left guessing, so why did my hamster die? Well, these things happen, yes, but why does anything die? And if you leave it at that point, then you're in trouble. If you explore further why your child's asking that question, then you can talk through and explore together, which is the shoulder to shoulder idea. It's the fear that I'm meant to be the authority. I'm meant to have all the right answers. Whereas actually the real position is, it doesn't matter if you don't have any right answers. What you do have is unique to yourself and your child, which is the quality of your relationship with your child. And you might have all the right answers, but they might have no impact at all if the quality of your relationship is non-existent. It's the relationship which gives that child the safety to open up and share those what they're thinking, and gives them the chance and you the chance to build that strong foundation that Kieran's talking about.
I think that's a really good point to draw this to a close, this one, for now, anyway, that the idea of listening, we start with the importance of telling stories, of storytelling, but actually you can't separate storytelling out from listening. And the key, for children and for children's spirituality, the storytelling is integral to the story listening to their stories. And I think that's the key point that perhaps we need to take forward from this. So I'd like to say thank you to my guest, to Nick and to Kieran, and till next time.